I stayed in a cabin in the Adirondack Mountains. There are strange rules to follow. They say the mountains conceal their mysteries deep beneath their rugged terrain, and that some places are better left undisturbed. I learned this lesson the hard way in a cabin hidden in the heart of the Adirondack Mountains, near a place ominously known as Black Bear Summit. The locals refer to it as the Shadow Haven Cabin, a seemingly inviting name for a place so haunting. I never imagined I'd end up there, much less trapped by the eerie whispers of an ancient radio. It all started on a chilly November evening, the kind of night where the wind screams through the treetops like a banshee mourning her loss. I had sought refuge in the Adirondacks after losing almost everything that mattered: my career, my home, my family. 40 years old and burdened with scars, both visible and hidden, from my time in the military, I spent my days repairing old machines in a small rented garage, hoping to mend not just broken parts but pieces of myself. That fateful night, I stumbled across the radio. It was an ancient, battered device, worn and dusty, with knobs that barely turned and wires frayed as if gnawed by vermin. I don't know why it caught my eye. Maybe it was the faint hum it emitted when I plugged it in, or the static that pulsed with a rhythm almost like a heartbeat. Whatever the reason, I couldn't walk away from it. As I adjusted the dials, the static receded, replaced by a voice. It wasn't an ordinary voice. It was warped, garbled, yet uncannily clear. It said, "You've been chosen. The rules must be followed, or the night will claim you." I froze in place. A part of me wanted to yank the cord from the wall and toss the radio into the nearest dumpster, but my hand lingered on the knob. The voice continued, reciting a series of rules in a tone so steady it was almost hypnotic. "Secure all doors and windows by 10 p.m. sharp. The shadows come first. If you hear footsteps on the porch, do not look outside. Ignore the knocks. Keep the fireplace burning at all times. It is the only thing they fear. Should the radio change frequency, correct it immediately. Letting it drift is perilous. Never leave the cabin after sunset, no matter what you hear. If your reflection moves independently, shut your eyes and count to 10. Before dawn, you must answer the final question. Failure is not an option." The static resumed as abruptly as it had stopped, leaving me clutching the radio in the dim glow of my garage. The words echoed in my mind, chilling me to my core. I should have ignored it. I should have left it there. Yet, somehow, I couldn't. By the time I realized the radio was still in my hands, I was standing at the forest's edge, staring at the infamous Shadow Haven cabin. The first thing I noticed about the cabin was the unsettling stillness. Tucked deep within the Adirondack wilderness, it exuded an air of abandonment, as though it had been left untouched for decades. The wooden shingles on the roof were warped and weathered, and ivy snaked up its sides like veins on a decaying body. For all its quaintness, there was nothing welcoming about it. I parked my battered Chevy truck on the uneven dirt path that led to the cabin. The sun dipped behind the mountains, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and crimson. In my hands, the radio remained silent, but it still gave off that faint, almost living hum. As I approached the porch, the wooden planks creaked beneath my boots. A rusted key lay conspicuously on the windowsill, too convenient to be coincidence. I hesitated before picking it up, my mind racing with the possibility of some elaborate joke. But as the wind picked up, whispering through the trees like a symphony of unseen voices, I knew this was something far more sinister. The door groaned open, revealing the cabin's interior. It was exactly what I had envisioned: dim, dusty, and suffocating with the musty scent of decayed wood. A single room stretched before me, dominated by a stone fireplace along one wall. In the center sat a rickety table surrounded by mismatched chairs. To my right, a narrow staircase spiraled up to a loft, and in the far corner, a bed sagged under the weight of disuse. I placed the radio on the table, its silent presence almost mocking me. The rules echoed in my mind as I surveyed the space, methodically checking for potential dangers. After bolting the door behind me, I double-checked the locks, just as instructed. The first signs of trouble surfaced at precisely 9:55 p.m. I was stacking firewood near the hearth, preparing to light the fireplace, when the radio crackled to life. 5 minutes, the distorted voice warned. 5 minutes to secure yourself. The air seemed to grow heavier, pressing against me as the words sank in. Heart pounding, I scrambled to check the windows once more, ensuring the shutters were firmly latched. Outside, the forest had become unnaturally dark, the skeletal trees casting elongated shadows that seemed to stretch toward the cabin. At exactly 10 p.m., the voice returned. The shadows are here. My pulse thundered in my chest as I peered out the window. Nothing stirred, yet the silence was oppressive, almost deafening. I turned back to the fireplace, fumbling with the matches to ignite the kindling. The fire roared to life just as a faint sound reached my ears, footsteps on the porch, slow, deliberate, and unnervingly heavy. I froze, the rules flashing through my mind. If you hear footsteps on the porch, do not look outside. Ignore the knocks. My instincts screamed at me to flee, to grab the radio and run, but my body felt paralyzed. Knock. 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 The sound reverberated through the cabin, each knock heavier than the last. My breath caught in my throat as I backed away from the door, gripping the poker from the fireplace like it was a weapon. The footsteps circled the cabin, dragging across the porch with an unnatural rhythm. Then, as suddenly as they had started, they stopped. I remained frozen, staring at the door, my grip on the poker tightening as the fire crackled behind me. The radio stayed silent, as though it, too, was waiting for my next move. The silence stretched interminably after the knock ceased. I stayed rooted to the spot by the fireplace, clutching the poker so tightly my knuckles ached. Outside, the darkness seemed alive, pressing against the windows like a sentient force. Inside, something was different, something worse. The fire's glow danced along the cabin walls, and for a fleeting moment, I thought I saw movement, a shadow slipping just beyond the edge of the light. Stay in the light, the voice on the radio had warned. Those words echoed in my mind as I scanned the room, my eyes adjusting to the flickering glow of the fire. The radio sat motionless on the table, its metallic surface catching faint glints of light. I willed it to speak again, to offer guidance, but it remained stubbornly quiet. A creak from the loft above shattered the silence. My eyes darted upward. The wooden staircase groaned under some unseen weight, as if someone, or something, was descending. I swallowed hard, repeating the rule to myself: do not investigate noises from the loft. Turning my back to the staircase, I focused on the fire. My trembling hand added another log, the flames sparking to life and casting sharper, almost desperate shadows across the room. But those shadows, something was wrong. They moved erratically, out of sync with the firelight, twisting and contorting as if possessed by their own will. A sudden, icy breeze swept through the room, extinguishing the flames in an instant. The darkness surged in, suffocating and absolute. Panic clawed at me as I fumbled with the matches, my shaking hands barely managing to strike one. A fragile flame sprang to life, illuminating the immediate area with a weak glow. I relit the fire, the room once again filling with warmth and light. But when I turned back toward the table, the radio was gone. What the hell? I muttered, my voice barely audible. It had been right there. My gaze darted around the room, my heart pounding. The shadows were still now, but they felt oppressive, as though they were pressing down on me with an almost physical weight. The scraping sound returned, louder this time, and much closer. I turned toward the source, my eyes locking onto the staircase. Something was coming down, slowly and deliberately. I couldn't see it, but its presence was undeniable, a heavy, suffocating force that made it difficult to breathe. Clenching the poker tighter, I fought the overwhelming urge to run, but there was nowhere to go. The door was bolted, and the windows were securely shuttered. Backing toward the fireplace, I kept my eyes fixed on the staircase. The rules replayed in my mind, a desperate mantra: do not confront what comes from the loft. Then the radio crackled to life, its voice distorted but urgent. It's testing you, it said. Don't give in. The shadow reached the base of the stairs, but it didn't step into the light. It lingered at the edge, its form shifting and writhing like a plume of smoke trapped in a glass jar. It had no face, no discernible features, yet its gaze, cold, unyielding, bore into me. I forced myself to turn away, my eyes locking on the fire as the rules demanded. Time stretched unbearably, each second felt like an eternity as the presence loomed, watching. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. The oppressive weight lifted, and the room seemed to exhale. I turned back toward the staircase, but it was empty. The shadows retreated to their corners, almost as if they had been waiting for something. The radio spoke again, its tone more insistent this time. You're not alone. Remember the rules. They're the only thing keeping you alive. I collapsed to the floor, my body trembling as the adrenaline ebbed away. The fire crackled softly, its light providing a fragile sense of security. But deep down, I knew the truth. There was no safety here, no reprieve. I couldn't afford to let my guard down, not for a moment. The next morning, or what I assumed was morning, the fire had dwindled to embers, leaving the cabin cloaked in a dull gray haze. My limbs were stiff and aching, every muscle protesting as I stretched. The radio was back on the table, as if it had never moved. Its dials were still, its surface eerily quiet. I hesitated before moving closer, half expecting the object to spring to life the moment I touched it. Yet, when I finally picked it up, the cold metal was solid and unmistakably real. I turned it over in my hands, searching for any evidence of what might have occurred during the night. Nothing seemed amiss until my gaze landed on a small piece of paper tucked underneath its base. It was the same sheet from the previous night, with the rules written in precise, blocky handwriting. But something was different. My chest tightened as I scanned the list. Keep the fire burning without interruption. Never make eye contact with the shadows. Steer clear of the loft at night, no matter what you hear. Do not open the door after dark, even if someone is knocking. Ignore any voices calling your name. Follow the radio's instructions above all else. Erase all traces of your presence. That last rule was new. My mind reeled as I reread it. Erase all traces? What could that possibly mean? My eyes darted around the cabin, suddenly attuned to every object I had interacted with, the chair I sat in by the fire, the blanket draped over my shoulders, the dishes I'd used for my meager meal. How could I completely erase any evidence that I'd ever been here? A crackle from the radio snapped me out of my spiraling thoughts. You are being watched, the voice intoned, calm yet weighted with warning. The cabin does not tolerate intruders. I froze, my fingers clutching the scrap of paper tightly. What does that mean? I whispered hoarsely, though I knew there would be no response. But the voice continued, as if it had anticipated my question. Destroy everything you've touched. Every trace. The cabin must remain untouched. A chill ran down my spine. Was this why the rental had been so inexpensive? Was it even meant to be rented at all? The thought of some unseen force watching me, something malevolent lurking within the shadows, made my skin crawl. My eyes flicked toward the fireplace, its embers barely clinging to life. Would burning everything appease whatever was out there? Or was this some sinister ploy designed to leave me even more vulnerable? The rules were clear, and so far, the voice on the radio hadn't led me astray. Hesitant but resolute, I grabbed the chair first, splintering it into pieces small enough to feed into the hearth. The fire roared back to life as the wood ignited, sparks dancing up the chimney. Next, I tossed in the blanket, watching as the soft fabric shriveled and blackened in the flames. One by one, every item I had used went into the fire. My hands shook with each piece I sacrificed, every object feeling like another part of myself being erased. The acrid smell of smoke and charred wood thickened the air, but I kept going until nothing remained, not a single sign that I'd ever set foot inside the cabin. The radio crackled again, its tone softer this time. Good, it said. You've earned another day. Another day. That was all it promised, a brief reprieve. My chest ached as the gravity of my predicament sank in. I wasn't surviving, I was barely hanging on, treading water as the tide dragged me deeper. The silence of the cabin pressed down on me, broken only by the faint crackle of the fire. I sat in the center of the room, staring at the walls, half expecting them to collapse around me at any moment. Something about the cabin had shifted. It wasn't a tangible change, not something I could see or touch. It was a feeling, a suffocating heaviness that wrapped around my chest like a vice. As the hours crept by, I began to notice faint smudges on the wooden walls. At first, they were subtle, barely discernible, just imperfections in the grain, or so I thought. But as the firelight flickered, those smudges began to take shape, forming long, jagged lines that twisted and curled like the roots of a tree. I rose unsteadily to my feet, approaching the nearest wall with my heart pounding in my ears. The markings were more distinct now, deep grooves carved into the wood. I traced them with trembling fingers, feeling the rough, splintered edges beneath my touch. These weren't random scratches. They were words. "You cannot leave." My breath hitched. I stumbled back, scanning the room as my pulse raced. The markings weren't confined to just one wall anymore. They spread, crawling like ivy across every surface. More words emerged, etched in an angry, jagged scrawl. "Stay silent after midnight. Do not trust the light. The forest is not empty." Cold sweat trickled down my spine as I struggled to comprehend what I was seeing. Who, or what, had written these? Had they always been there, hidden beneath the surface, waiting to reveal themselves? Or was the cabin itself trying to warn me? The radio sprang to life again, its static slicing through the oppressive quiet like a blade. I jumped, nearly knocking over the chair I had been sitting in earlier. "Do not touch the walls," the voice commanded, sharp and unyielding. "They are not meant for you." My stomach twisted into knots. I had already touched them. Panic surged through me like a flood, and I frantically wiped my hands on my jeans, desperate to erase whatever link I might have just created. What happens if I did? I murmured under my breath, even though I knew the radio would never reply. The fire in the hearth flickered weakly, its once vivid flames shrinking into a feeble, trembling glow. Shadows crept across the room, stretching long and grotesque, distorting as they spread. I backed away from the walls, my pulse hammering as the darkness deepened and thickened, becoming almost tangible. And then I heard it, a faint, grating noise, like claws dragging along wood. It was coming from the walls. I froze in place, my eyes darting toward the source of the sound. The markings on the walls began to shift, writhing as though alive. The words twisted and contorted, rearranging themselves into a new message right before my eyes. "You are being watched." The scraping sound grew louder, more frenzied. It wasn't confined to the walls anymore, it was everywhere, filling the cabin, echoing inside my head. I clutched the radio tightly against my chest, as though it were a talisman. "What do I do?" I shouted, my voice trembling and raw. The radio hissed with static, its volume rising until the noise was nearly unbearable. Then, cutting through the chaos, the voice returned, "Stay inside. Do not respond." "Respond to what?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. But the radio went silent again before I could get an answer. The scratching stopped abruptly. An oppressive silence settled over the cabin. And then, cutting through the stillness, came a knock. 3 sharp, deliberate raps, the sound of knuckles on wood. I froze at the sound, my breath catching in my throat. It was impossibly ordinary, a detail so mundane it felt absurd in the context of everything else. Who, or what, could be outside this cabin, in the middle of nowhere? And why knock, as though politely requesting to come in? The fire sputtered weakly in the hearth, its dim light casting erratic, shifting shadows on the walls. I tightened my grip on the radio, the cold metal grounding me as my thoughts spiraled. The voice on the radio had warned me not to respond, but every instinct screamed at me to defy that advice. Ignoring it felt reckless, but acknowledging it, whatever it was, felt like an even greater risk. Another knock echoed through the cabin, louder and more insistent. 3 sharp raps that seemed to vibrate through the walls. My knees shook as I stood and began to approach the door, each step feeling heavier than the last, as though I were trudging toward my own execution. My hand hovered over the doorknob, trembling. Pressing my ear against the wooden surface, I strained to hear. Nothing. Just an oppressive, suffocating silence. I almost turned away, convinced to leave it alone, when the knock came again. This time it was forceful, rattling the door on its hinges. I stumbled backward, heart pounding wildly. My eyes darted to the windows, but they revealed nothing. The world beyond was shrouded in an impenetrable darkness. It didn't feel like there was something outside, it felt like everything was. The radio crackled suddenly, startling me. I clutched it tighter as the voice returned, colder and sharper than before. Do not open the door. I nodded instinctively, even though I knew the voice couldn't see me. My thoughts raced, scrambling for logic, for a reason to make sense of this. Who's out there? I whispered, the words barely audible. Do not open the door, the voice repeated firmly, the urgency unmistakable. It is not who you think. Not who I think. Did that mean it was someone I knew? Or something that could mimic them? My hands curled into fists, nails digging into my palms as I tried to keep myself steady. The knock came again, relentless and unyielding. Then, cutting through the air like a knife, came a voice from the other side of the door, low, gravelly, and chillingly familiar. David, open up. It's me. My body froze, every muscle locked in place. The voice was mine. The sheer impossibility of it hit me like a punch to the gut. My legs buckled, and I collapsed into the nearest chair, head spinning as I tried to process what I had just heard. The fire dimmed further, its light now barely more than a faint flicker. David, the voice called again, this time with more force. You can't stay in there forever. Open the door. I shook my head violently, clutching the radio as if my life depended on it. What's happening? I hissed into the device, desperation cracking my voice. What is this? The static on the radio intensified for a moment before the voice finally answered, it's testing you. Testing me? The phrase felt meaningless, impossible to grasp. My gaze darted to the door, sweat pouring down my face. The voice outside grew louder, angrier, its tone laced with a furious urgency. Open the door, David. Let me in. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to flee, to get as far away from the door as possible. But I couldn't move. My body was frozen, anchored in place by a terror so profound it felt like it would consume me. The knocking ceased suddenly, leaving behind an unbearable silence. And then, as if in slow motion, the doorknob began to turn. The doorknob rotated slowly, each metallic groan slicing through the oppressive quiet like a blade. I shot upright, my chest heaving as though I couldn't catch my breath. My fingers gripped the radio so tightly it felt as though it had melded with my hand. This was it, the moment that would either confirm the warnings or completely shatter my sanity. The door didn't swing wide open. Instead, it stopped, barely ajar by a sliver, exposing a thin strip of shadow beyond. No figure emerged, no outline of anything recognizable, just a void of blackness so profound it seemed ready to consume me if I stared for too long. David, the voice came again, but this time it wasn't beyond the door. It emanated from the radio. Yet it wasn't the same voice as before. This one was garbled, twisted into a grotesque imitation of my own. You're not doing so well, are you? The fire crackled faintly before sputtering out almost entirely, reduced to weak embers that cloaked the room in dim shadows. I staggered backward instinctively, increasing the distance between me and the door. My voice faltered as I shouted into the radio, "What do you want from me?" A sinister laugh buzzed through the speaker. Want? No, David. It's about what you want. Isn't that why you're here? To mend what's been broken. My breath caught. It felt as though the very air had been drained from the room. The voice knew. It knew about the memories that haunted me, battlefields, shattered lives, and faces I couldn't save. My hands quivered as I clung tighter to the radio. The door creaked wider, just enough for something to slide through, a shadow. It didn't crawl or step. Instead, it flowed, unnervingly smooth and unnatural, its shape constantly shifting as though it couldn't decide what form to take. It stopped short of entering fully, but even without eyes, I could feel its attention fixed on me, piercing and unrelenting. The voice from the radio softened, becoming almost soothing. "There is a way out, David. A way to escape all of this." The shadow edged closer, its inky form seeping into the floor like liquid spreading across a surface. I wanted to flee, but my legs were immovable, as if weighed down by invisible chains. "How?" I whispered, the words barely audible over the thundering of my heart. The radio hissed. "Let it in." I recoiled instantly, shaking my head violently. "No. Absolutely not." The shadow stretched out something, a limb or perhaps just an extension of itself. It brushed against the table, leaving behind a dark smear that shimmered unnaturally in the faint light. The voice persisted, coaxing. "You're exhausted, David. Exhausted from running. Weary from remembering. Let it in, and it will all disappear." Tears stung the corners of my eyes as the weight of its words bore down on me. My mind raced to the memories I tried to suppress, the faces of those I'd failed, their voices haunting me in every quiet moment. But then, like a beacon in the chaos, the rules came to mind, etched on the cabin's walls and repeated through the radio. My fists tightened, the sharp pain grounding me in the moment. "No," I said resolutely, my voice firm and steady for the first time all night. "I'm not letting it in." The shadow stilled, its form trembling as though my defiance had struck a chord. The radio erupted into static before the voice returned, its tone darker and laced with anger. "You've made a grave mistake." The shadow lunged forward, extinguishing the fire completely and plunging the room into a choking blackness. The darkness pressed in on me, a tangible force that made it impossible to breathe. My hand inched in front of my face, but I couldn't even see that. Only the faint hum of the radio grounded me in the void. The shadow seemed to consume everything, the light, the room, and perhaps even my resolve. My chest constricted as the voice returned, eerily calm but venomous. "David," it purred. "You've chosen defiance. But defiance always has a cost." The cabin groaned under an unseen strain. The beams above creaked ominously, threatening to collapse under invisible pressure. The air chilled further, carrying with it a low murmur of voices, a chorus of regret and sorrow. They weren't the commanding tones of the radio but soft, mournful whispers. Each one felt like an echo of a life lost or a decision regretted. I stumbled back, my foot catching on the edge of the cot and sending me sprawling to the ground. The radio tumbled from my grip, its static amplifying into an unbearable, piercing rhythm that synced with the erratic pounding of my heart. The whispers crescendoed, merging into one commanding voice. "You can still fix this, David. Open the door." I turned toward the door, now closed once again. But it was different this time. The wood had darkened, warped, as though it had endured centuries in mere moments. The handle shimmered faintly in the darkness, almost inviting. The rules flashed through my head once more. Do not open the door for anyone, no matter how they beg or threaten. I shook my head, muttering to myself, "It's a trick. It has to be a trick." Then the knock came. Faint at first, almost imperceptible over the static. But it grew louder, more demanding. A second knock, followed by a third. Each knock felt like a hammer striking against my skull. "David," the voice outside pleaded, now sounding frantic. But it wasn't the shadow's distorted tone, it was a woman's voice. "Please, I'm lost. It's so cold out here. I need help." I froze in place. It sounded human, too convincingly human to be a mere trick. But then the second rule surfaced in my mind, if someone outside asks for help, ignore them. They are not who they pretend to be. The gentle knocks escalated into desperate pounding, and the woman's voice cracked with anguish. Please. I don't want to die out here. I clamped my hands over my ears, rocking back and forth on the floor. It's not real. It's not real, I whispered fervently. The door rattled violently, as if something outside was trying to force its way in. Then, the voice shifted. It was no longer a woman, it was my own voice, distorted into a cruel parody. David, you're pathetic. You're letting them suffer because of your fear. The shadows along the walls contorted, twisting into grotesque shapes that jeered at me. The pounding ceased all at once, leaving behind a silence so oppressive it made my ears ache. Open the door, the radio hissed menacingly. I crawled into the corner, clutching my knees tightly. The rules were my only anchor. No, I whispered, my voice quivering. I won't break them. The door creaked open slightly on its own. A thin ray of pale, unnatural light spilled through the crack. I squeezed my eyes shut, but the light seemed to touch my skin like icy fingers, invasive and unwelcome. David, the voice whispered now from behind me, cold and unnervingly soft. I couldn't turn around. I didn't dare. And then came the final trial. When I opened my eyes again, the cabin was unsettlingly quiet. The fire was once again burning faintly in the hearth, crackling gently but giving no warmth. The door was shut as if it had never moved. Everything appeared normal. Too normal. My body ached as though I had run a marathon, but I was alive, or so I thought. I stumbled to my feet, the night's weight pressing heavily on me. In the middle of the room sat the radio, unscathed. Its earlier frenzied static had quieted to a low, steady hum. The cabin looked brighter now, with pale rays of dawn seeping through the warped slats of wood. Relief washed over me like a tide. I had survived. I had obeyed the rules. But the relief didn't last long. As I approached the door, ready to leave, something caught my eye. On the wall opposite the hearth was a mirror I hadn't seen before. Its surface was smeared with grime, as though it had been neglected for years. I hesitated before moving closer, my breath fogging the air. When I finally stood before it, my stomach sank. The reflection staring back wasn't mine. It looked like me, same features, same body, but its eyes were void of life, hollow and lifeless. Its skin was pale, almost corpse-like. The figure in the mirror was mouthing words silently. Trembling, I leaned closer, my hand reaching for the glass despite myself. Help me, the reflection whispered faintly. I stumbled backward, my heart racing. This wasn't a trick of the dim light or my imagination. It was real. It wasn't just a reflection. It was another version of me. The radio suddenly erupted in loud, jagged static, its intensity nearly unbearable. David, the voice crackled, sharper than ever. Now you understand. What do you want from me? I screamed, spinning in circles, searching for something, anything. I followed the rules. I did everything you told me. The shadows began to move again, swirling together to form human-like figures. Men and women of various ages emerged from the darkness, their faces hollow and despondent, their forms partially consumed by the inky black. They were trapped, victims of the same game, bound by the same choices. You didn't survive, the voice from the radio said, oozing malice. You've only just begun. The door burst open, but instead of the forest beyond, there was an infinite void of blackness. The shadowy figures moved toward me, skeletal hands reaching out. Wait! I cried, my voice cracking. You can't do this. I followed the rules. The figures didn't falter. The room's temperature dropped even further, and the fire extinguished in a puff of smoke. The light spilling from the open door pulled at me, like a vacuum dragging me toward its depths. The radio's voice spoke one final time, a cruel laugh laced beneath its words. The rules aren't meant to save you. They're meant to prepare you for eternity. The darkness enveloped me, dragging me into its endless void. My screams echoed into the abyss, mingling with the cries of countless others who had come before me. Weeks later, hikers stumbled upon the cabin deep within the Adirondack Mountains. Inside, they discovered an old radio emitting faint static and a handwritten list of rules. One hiker, a young woman, picked up the list, curiosity lighting up her face. The radio crackled to life. Hello. If you're hearing this, listen closely. You must follow these rules. And thus, the cycle began anew. Would you follow the rules, or would you risk breaking them to run away from home? Write your opinion in the comments, like and subscribe to the channel. Let's get 1,000 subscribers together.